So we are recording. Hello, I'm Paul
Me.
Humphreys. No, you don't have to
Yep.
say anything. You be quiet. I'm Paul Humphreys. This is Rheophilia Interviews in Freshwater Science. And today I have Professor. Are you still a professor? Do we still call you a professor once you do what you're doing and
Yeah.
leave?
Yes.
Because you
At
called
this
yourself
point.
a former professor before.
Well, no. I've not been called a former professor. Well, I've been in an adjunct professor position for the last couple of years. Prior to that, it was research professor. But no, they apparently still call me professor. But yeah.
Okay, Professor Peter Davies with the E in the middle because there's unfortunately, another Peter Davies in freshwater science. I
I,
know.
I hope we weren't going to talk about him.
Sorry, we won't talk about him. We won't talk about him at all.
Okay.
um, and I can't read my notes because it's so dark. Former professor, he said, of zoology and environment, and an adjunct professor at the School of Creative Arts and Media at the University of Tasmania. We'll
Hmm.
get on to the arts and media stuff as we go along through the interview. So thanks for coming along, Peter. And I've got to declare a conflict of interest early on because Peter and I have known each other for a good part of 40 years. We've worked together and we're good friends. And so this could be a bit of a disaster, this interview, because I'm going to try to
Well,
maintain my composure.
I think at this point I should declare that we're no longer friends.
Well,
Hopefully.
we may not be at the end of this anyway. Who
No.
knows?
No.
Um, and I also want to just start off too with telling a little bit of a story when we first met, because it was formative for me and it sort of influenced what happened afterwards. Um, I I was an honours student. I just turned 21, and I had a an old clapped out motorbike. I was doing honours at Monash with Sam Lake, who comes up quite a lot in his interviews, not surprisingly. And I decided I would go up to Narrandera for the Australian Society for Fish Biology conference. This is 1983, and it was August, and it was bloody freezing. And I remember almost not getting there because it was so cold, and I never had the gear to keep myself warm. And I turned up at this conference knowing nobody except John Kewen. I knew one person at the conference, so I felt very much out of it. And this young, bespectacled, I think you had round glasses at the time,
I did. I
bit
did.
bit John Lennon-ish.
For
Um,
those who are familiar with me, I usually look like this.
right.
So that's
Yes.
how
Now I recognise you.
no.
Gave a talk. He was a PhD student, and I remember sitting opposite him, you, at the conference dinner where they read out the best student talk. Do you remember that?
No.
No. And we got
No.
chatting, and I very politely and kindly told you that I thought you had in the bag that you had given the best talk, and but then you didn't win, which was, and I remember you crying into your tiramisu or whatever it was for dessert. It did make me feel sorry for you. But I also you were so kind to me to talk to me at that conference and make me feel like I wasn't completely alone. And the rest is history, as some of it perhaps we will hear. But anyway, that's where we first met. Um, and let's then go back even further, if you don't mind, because you've been, I think, if I summarise your working career, at least, and I've done a few of these interviews, and people's pathways take all sorts of directions. It's interesting, but yours is quite eclectic, which is one thing I really like about people's careers if they are eclectic. But how did you? Can we start off at the beginning and not I mean not a conception, but let's go a bit further on. What where did you come from? What got you interested in science in the first place?
I come ultimately. I come from the UK and Belgium, a strange mixed family. And my father died in the 60s, and my mother when I was quite young, and my mother sent me off to Australia with an elderly gentleman who was my uncle by marriage, but his wife, my aunt, had died. and my godfather, and then a little while later he became my stepfather. But he was Tasmanian, so I was brought up by this elderly gentleman to Tasmania, and he was always he was one of the last generation of gentlemen inventors. So he was always tinkering about. He always he was very much into physics and light. He had two other brothers who were into light as well. Because
What was his name? What was his name, Peter?
Eric Waterworth, and the three Waterworth brothers. One was an optometrist, one was an ophthalmologist, and then Eric was I don't know how you describe it, a light inventor. So he was involved with designing, making lenses from plate glass windows during the Second World War, because the supply of lenses had been cut off by the German blockades. With physics professor at the time at the university, and that links ultimately to me. And I'll get through it fairly quickly.
No, that's okay.
The two of them made a pitch to the Commonwealth government at the time that they could make bomb sights and rifle sights and aerial imagery lenses for large format cameras and stuff from plate glass, and they were poo-pooed. But then they built a special, vacuum furnace, and made these lenses and flew up to Canberra and pulled them out of their pockets and put them on the table. And they got a contract with the military department at the time, which lasted throughout the entire war, and then led on to then Eric making his living from a factory which made microscopes and projectors and all this sort of stuff, yada yada. The link for me then was partly that sort of semi-intellectual atmosphere, because it was quite a booky, musicy, semi-sciencey atmosphere anyway. But when I first came out to Australia in late 68, my birthday was about 10 days later after arriving. And the physics professor, Lester Macaulay, who was great mates with Eric, this is obviously well after the war, said, well, if this young boy is coming from Blighty, he has to go west. He has to go into the wilderness, because he was actually one of the early sort of rampantly political at that stage Greens, quite vocal in the newspaper and all this sort of stuff. Mm. So he gifted me for my birthday on arriving a flight into Lake Pedder.
Wow!
So on a beautiful day, like it is actually here today, and the pilot at the time was a guy called Jim England, who was a notoriously sort of adventurous pilot. So he took us for a spin around all the major mountain ranges in the southwest of Tasmania, and then we landed on the beach. And Professor Jackson, who was then the professor of botany, was camping there at the time. He did another one of these sort of paternal instructions and said, well, you get onto that, I've forgotten what it's called, an inflatable bed or something, a lilo, and you paddle up that creek, which is Maria Creek. And I paddled up that creek on my own, and
you were 10 at this time.
Yeah, and suddenly emerged into this vast wetland full of reeds, dragonflies, birds, blue sky, mountain ranges, and I fell off the lilo, but discovered, of course, that it was quite shallow and warm, and it was tannic, this tea thing. And I looked around and I thought, I'm in paradise. I literally felt that I had somehow gone through the gates of paradise, and that day infected me. And I went by different routes after that, but I ultimately, I'll probably say later on, came back to that moment, which was really quite one of those, what do you call, defining moments. So that's kind of the root, what do you call it, the origin story for me. Mm.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have that sort of epiphany or experience at some stage that really that at least sparks off some sort of major interest, which may not be realized at that moment, but infects you.
It was realized quite a lot later, but it was definitely the seminal thing. In fact, many years later, I was doing things I didn't really want to do, work-wise I'm talking about, but I was on the roof painting, and I was at one of those moments in life where you think, oh God, it's crossroads, what am I going to do with it? And I literally suddenly had a flash of that day in my head. I burst into tears, and that was it. I suddenly realized, wow, why am I wasting my time doing anything else? So that was kind of it, really.
So your stepfather, was your godfather, your stepfather, Eric, obviously that he was very influential in various ways in your life.
Yeah.
What about your mother? Did you?
My mother's a very creative person. She wasn't at all, what I'd call classically intellectual at all. She was very much a creature of emotion, but she was very, she was always trying out new things. She was full of energy. She was always trying some new escapade in whatever arts, crafts, you name it. We had a kiln at the back of the house, which was built from an old gasworks that had been demolished in Hobart. It was a family effort. We built the kiln and the pottery room and all that stuff, and used to fire lots of pottery, both for my mother and her friends. So it was this constant sort of flow of potters and ceramicists and all that sort of stuff who used to come through the house. But that was one example, but she's into all sorts of stuff like that all the time. So there was a creative energy that flowed from her.
And do you think you were influenced by that because you've as you sort of have alluded to, you've moved to some extent?
Yeah, because I had one point in my life where I was either going to be a musician or a scientist, and
Thank God.
so yeah, no, yeah, I'm very so that was that came out of both the arts and sort of music environment that I was bathed in.
Where was the music? Where was the music influence from? Where did that come
Well, the
from?
music influence was from the Waterworth side. My aunt, well, actually, no, my aunt was a Davies. So my eldest aunt, who married Eric, came out to Tasmania. She had been living out here after the war. Eric had wooed her and brought her out here, and she was the first female violinist in the symphony orchestra in Tasmania.
All right.
She was quite a musician, and there's a Steinway in the house and all this sort of stuff. So there's music all the time, and at the same time, Eric was completely besotted with listening to the sort of late romantic right through to he kind of stopped at Stockhausen, but a lot of music, and it was constantly on all the time in the house. And I would go to sleep listening to Mahler or Delius or all sorts of stuff. And I was one of those teenagers who used to lie on the floor in winter in front of the fire and in ecstasies to Das Lied von der Erde, instead of the Beatles. But I eventually went off piste and got into Pink Floyd and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, so that was it. Yeah, it was a very musical environment.
Okay, so you did your undergraduate at University of Tasmania, but then you also spent some time in France during undergraduate. Is that right? And how did that come about?
Well, just a spasm of primarily, I think my mother's enthusiasm to keep me infected with the European zeitgeist, because she was Northern French Belgian, Belgian primarily in origin, and so there was always that sort of connection that she wanted us, my brother as well, and me to maintain. So that it came about through that, and I spent some time in Grenoble University of Grenoble, and went a little bit wayward there because I got more into history of art than I did into science, but that which was terrific. But then most of my training, academic training, has been at the University of Tasmania.
Yeah. So you decided to do honours. You did honours in chemistry.
Yeah,
Right?
I got lured by the being as a lot of us are slightly on the spectrum. I got lured by the logical appeal of synthetic chemistry. So I became a synthetic chemist for a while, which was terrible for my health, I think, or terrible for everyone around me's health, because I lost 2 lecturers to some form of cancer.
Wow.
That was terrible. We're talking the 70s. They'd only just invented the idea of fume hoods that worked. There was solvent fug in the air all the time. We used to wash our hands in chloroform and methanol and all that sort of stuff. And acetone, we thought it was wonderful. And you stick your hand at the end of the day in the lab under the UV lamp, and you'd have blotches of wonderful colours all over your skin. It's just appalling, really. Which probably has led to some of my current sort of health issues. But anyway, but I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. There's almost a magical power when you're synthesizing a new molecule and you see it crystallizing in a round bottom flask for the first time. It's sort of slightly orgasmic. and you prove that it's the thing that you were making, that sort of thing. And when it's a molecule that may have appeared in nature somewhere obviously in the vast universe, but hasn't appeared in the
Yeah, there's a real creativity obviously associated with that. Did you feel is there an artistic type of creativity to that, or is it purely
Not really,
science?
not really. I think it's more of it's not cooking by numbers, but it certainly is a process, and you learn all the little, you have all the little tools at your disposal, and you simply rearrange those tools and to try and make something new. So yeah, it was a kind of like apprentice science, really, more than anything else for me. And ultimately, I got sick of it. I realised it wasn't going to do any good to spend a life in a lab like that. Especially since one of my colleagues at the time was completely stooped over like a sort of a hunchback of Notre Dame, and I realised, oh my God, that's the way I'm going to go. So I ended up doing a postdoc at University of Sydney.
What about your PhD? So your PhD was in similar things?
My
Yeah.
PhD, my PhD was an attempt to branch out. So I did honours in synthetic chemistry, but by that stage I'd been severely infected with the green movement at that time. Eric Waterworth, the fellow I've been talking about, by then stepfather, was a huge supporter of the UTG, United Tasmania Group, and Lake Pedder Action Committee, and he had a building in Hobart, central Hobart, a sort of a scruffy little building hidden behind some of what are now sort of skyscrapers.
Can I interrupt you? Can you just tell me a little bit about, because a lot of people won't know about the Lake Pedder situation and what was
okay. Well,
happening.
so I flew into Lake Pedder, as I mentioned earlier, and that was at the time when, just at the time when Hydro were, had their plans well established to flood it, to build a couple of dams, and flood it. A big social movement kicked off, and it was decided that really the way to try and influence things was to form a political party, the United Tasmania Group, whose almost single platform was stopping the flooding of Lake Pedder, which ultimately was unsuccessful. But my stepfather gave part of his building free to the Lake Pedder Action Committee, and part of the UTG as their base of sort of activism, and encouraged me to get involved. So I used to go on street rallies, and like a lot of other people at the time, kids at the time. So I card carrying Lake Pedder activists. Obviously influenced by my having flown in there. So, and I've walked in there several times before it flooded as well. So that whole period was really quite, for me as a young person, completely caught up in green, in kind of the nascent green politics at the time.
So that influenced your interest in toxicology?
Well, I'd done chemistry, and I realised, why have I done chemistry? And I'm actually interested in the natural world. So the logical bridge for me was to go from one to the other via ecotoxicology, and I started, Silent Spring, yada yada. So I got sort of seduced into starting to think about trying to work out. In Tasmania, they grow a lot of potatoes. They still do. They're spraying crap loads of chemicals on them, mainly to control some fungal infections. And so I started looking at the chemicals they were using, and then doing some toxicological work on that in relation to exposure of fish and various things. And one of the bits of that was to synthesize, the chemistry bit was to synthesize a radio-labeled, the pesticide itself that I was focused on, synthesize a radio-labeled version of it so that I could look at metabolites as they get excreted, or in rivers, and wetlands. So I wrote to the company at the time that was manufacturing it, Diamond Shamrock, asking if I could have a radio-labeled chlorothalonil, it was called. And first of all, they didn't reply. Of course, they thought this is just ridiculous, some strange letter from Tasmania asking about a chemical that they were gleefully spraying all over the US and Europe, and eventually then said back, no, we're not supplying it to unknown researchers, blah blah blah. So I decided I'd synthesize the molecule myself in a slightly unusual way, because you couldn't do it by introducing the carbon-14 into the benzene ring, which is really what I wanted to do, and then make the molecule. So So that was part of it, and then the rest of it was sort of environmental. Tracing the chemical out in the environment, looking for metabolites and breakdown products
So who
in some
was
of the stream.
who was supervising you? Who was supervising you for that?
A fellow well known to the two of us. Well, no, actually, I had two supervisors. My zoological supervisor was a fellow called Robert White,
Hmm.
who you know quite well, and I had someone in pharmacy, Stuart McLean, who supervised me, and he was fabulous.
Yep.
Really a great support.
And were there any other? I mean, were people like Richard Norris and stuff around there at that time? Because he,
Yeah, Norrie was sort of around that time. It was the era of Richard, but I didn't really connect with him so much because he left fairly. No, he left pretty early on, and I don't think he was necessarily resident there the whole time. But his crew were there, so there was a bunch of people like Cooge Coleman, Alistair Richardson was there, and Alistair was a terrific mentoring influence on me. He's a crayfish biologist, particularly.
Richard,
In,
yeah,
in,
yeah, I knew Alistair quite well, obviously. But Richard was doing cadmium work in the South Esk, I think. Was that his
in
PhD
doing
he was
stuff like
doing there?
that. Yeah, that's right. Now, I only really came across Richard as a human being later in relation to things to do with the National River Health Program.
Hmm.
And we developed an interesting working relationship through that. But I'd never really been exposed to him. We were both Callow youths. I don't think our paths crossed very much at that time. So,
And what about the fish you were using some fish in your toxicology work?
yeah, some of the galaxids. Well, that was the other thing. There was virtually nothing at that stage done on the toxicity of organic. Even the inorganics weren't terribly well looked at to galaxids. So I thought we'd do that. Did the standard lab rat stuff with rainbow trout and then also some galaxids. I kind of regret doing some of that now because it's basically putting fish in tanks and exposing them to low levels of chemicals. But that's the path I took at the
Yeah.
time.
And I'm sort of leading towards some of the fish stuff that you did later on, but was that where you sort of first got interested in fish, or were you a fisherman at that stage?
No, a completely hopeless fisherman. I've always dabbled around, doing a bit of marine fishing with members of the family, but not really. No, trout fishing was freshwater fishing. No, didn't really. But the ecology of freshwater fish started dawning on me when I started doing this ecotox work and realised, in fact, rather than focus on single species, responses, one should really start looking at the whole ecosystem. And then I just my head started popping with thinking about freshwater ecology. And it was at the tail end of the PhD, and I really wasn't able to exploit it. But I started going a bit insane and wasted an awful lot of time trying to build sort of semi-ecological models of responses to pesticide, and also some of the aquaculture things started interesting me because that was started to being on the horizon as well.
So it's often interesting to me because I've known a number of people who've come from either the chemistry side of things, or perhaps the geomorphology side of things, or the genetic side of things, and moved into ecology. And there's quite a lot of people who work in the hard sciences who think that ecology is pretty soft and pretty easy to do. But you're already dabbling in the ecological side of things at that stage, clearly.
Yeah. Well, certainly thinking about it, learning about it, spending a bit of time with other people who are doing it, and but always with an applied bent. There was a bit of a schism at the time between the people who wanted to do pure biology and considered the applied to be somewhat ridiculous and dirty under the fingernails, and yet were also kind of a green persuasion. You sort of think, well, how can you really gel those two? If you're going to have any influence on some beneficial outcomes for ecosystems, you're going to have to get do brown science or whatever it is rather than purely green or blue sky. Anyway.
And back in those days, I mean, even I remember when I sort of turned up as a green wet behind the ears master student in the mid '80s. Actually, I'm trying to think, 85 in Tasmania. There was certainly and beyond that, there were certainly very few biologists, let alone ecologists, working in government departments in many cases.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, so the
very true.
sort of work you were interested in, was it being done routinely in Tasmania at that time?
No, no, no. No. Obviously, there was a nascent national parks, government agency, which had wildlife ecologists there who mainly looked at issues to do with kangaroo, wallabies and kangaroos um, and that sort of game management. Really started off as a game management, which then moved into sort of ecology and conservation, particularly as the national parks and the World Heritage Area started,
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, there were fisheries. So there was marine fisheries and freshwater fisheries. And freshwater fisheries was based around one small, as you know well, one small agency, basically financed partly out of government and on trout fishing licenses. So its existence was basically a branch of the old gaming, the game management. Deer and trout are central to part of the culture of rural Tasmania. So so I ended up. Well, I was in a lab in Sydney doing synthesizing, unsurprisingly, radio label metabolites of cancer drugs that matched certain cancer binding sites in a pharmacy lab in University of Sydney. And again, it was one of those labs that was like, oh, this is just, I'm going down the wrong path here. And halfway, no, 3/4 of the way, I think, through the postdoc, I got a phone call from Rob Sloan, who had just been appointed commissioner of Inland Fisheries in Tasmania, saying, "Do you want to come down and work as a trout biologist?" Which is completely left field.
How did you know Rob Sloan?
I don't know, Rob. Someone had rung me and said, "Oh, there's this job coming back. If you want to work in water, aquatic stuff in Tasmania, this is really freshwater. This is really the place. You want to go." And so there was a job, and I sent in I think an application that was palpably silly, but he offered me the job.
Wow.
He rang me up and said, "Do you want to come down?" I said, "Yeah, that'd be fantastic." And so I finished off the postdoc, literally synthesizing one of the key molecules. I think I made about 4 micrograms of it. Proved it up, left it in a vial full of DMSO, which, if anyone knows chemical solvents, is impossible to remove. So I did it. I just proved its existence, basically, and that was it. And then left. And I left on a Friday night. Monday morning.
What year was this?
Oh, God.
Remember?
Um,
I mean, 1984?
84, I think. Yeah, that's about right. You know better than I do.
Well, it's just I think it was just not long before I came down to Tassie, I think.
And I've been to South America, and I've done a lot of traveling in South America just during the interval. And Friday night I went down to Hobart, said hello to my parents, and saw some friends, and then drove up to the Highlands. And Monday morning I opened the curtains and looked out from my bedroom at Lyowin, my bedroom Lyowin. I thought, what the hell have I done with my career? Looking across this vast moorland down to a lake, in what was a very small, as you know, a collection of concrete sort of Besserbrook houses, with one technical assistant, Bill, who was great, and one of the best freshwater labs in Australia. So I was actually pretty.
And what was your role? What did they expect you to do?
They expected me to measure trout. The core thing was to monitor the spawning runs of brown and rainbow trout at Great Lake and Arthur's Lake and various other things. To also then do a campaign of sampling of fish, focusing on trout throughout the state, because the anglers had been complaining, as they always do, that the trout stocks had been dwindling and the rivers all needed stocking, yada yada yada. So it was a kind of a project. The core project was to investigate that problem, and Rob is quite smart about these things, a very smart fellow, and he basically knew that stocking rivers was a waste of time, because a fellow called Aubrey Nichols from CSIR back in the 50s had already proved that by doing a really fantastic set of experiments in the northeast of Tasmania.
Can I stop you there for a second? This is where my link comes in. So Aubrey Nichols was the uncle of a good friend of mine a colleague and good friend of mine. Now, Nick Nichols, or Anthony Nichols, as his proper name is, everybody calls him Nick Nichols, and he is a scientist. He worked for CSIRO for a long time. He's still an adjunct with CSIRO, and he's in his mid 70s now, and he's also an adjunct with Charles State University, where I am, and we've been colleagues now probably for about, I don't know, close on 10 years, I would suspect, where he's living in Canberra and he comes periodically down to Albury to sit on the honours panel to assess the quality of the honours projects, because he's very statistically savvy. I haven't met a better R person than him. And whenever I go to Canberra to do research on books, he and I catch up for lunch routinely. And it was just out of the blue, something came up about Aubrey Nichols. And I said, and I think I might have even mentioned his name. And he said, that was my uncle.
Wow. I
Yeah.
was glad we knew that.
So he told me all about him. And then I drew that link between the work that you did, because I
Right.
know you published that
Well,
paper.
I basically revisited all of his work
Yeah.
that he did down here, because he actually did an amazing body of work, looking at age structure and marking trout, and just and sampling throughout the the St Patrick's and North Esk River catchments and elsewhere, and did a lot of really fine work on he's probably he's the best basically freshwater fisheries biologist that Tassie has seen, and everything was written down in blue ink for males and red ink for females, and vast records of data, and then reams and reams of computer paper to do one chi-square test. Unbelievable. So I inherited filing cabinets of all his data at this lab at Laiwini. And so I thought, right, okay, this is a gold mine that's just not, shouldn't be. This is trout, okay, so it's now
Sure.
essentially politically completely unacceptable, whatever, in terms of the environmental interest that I've got now. But it was my my entry point, and went and resampled all the sites that he'd sampled back in the 50s using, this is all electrofishing. He did, he used to drive around with a truck with a giant generator on the back and chuck these wires. It's dangerous as all buggery. So we basically replicated his sampling and looked at the age structure of the trout population. So we had to do a bunch of, scale age verification and things like that. So we did a bit of that. And Rob was right into that sort of stuff, Rob Sloan. And proved quite conclusively that the conclusions he'd come up with, sort of tentative conclusions at the end of his first study, which the government at that time poo-pooed. Well, no, they didn't all poo-poo it, but it was poo-pooed initially. That in Tasmania, at least, the trout populations are almost completely self-sustaining. Brown trout, which I'm talking about, some rainbow mainly brown, and that throwing fish around into the rivers was a waste of time. The acclimatization societies had done their damage, and the species was well established. And essentially, out of that came a bit of a story, which then drove my interest in climate change, because when you looked at the two sets of data years apart, a lot of the messages were very similar, but there was a fundamental difference in that there was an El Nino, significant El Nino, series of El Nino events that happened while we were doing this and after we were doing this sampling. Sorry, before we did sampling later, which put a giant hole in the recruitment of the populations, and something went bing, and we had a really good look in the system and found that there were classic situations where El Nino drives in eastern Tasmania particularly, drives the river flow, the rivers decline when the ENSO is high, obviously, but particularly in spring, early summer, which is when the egg nests of brown trout are full of eggs, and they're pretty much all in marginal gravel bars. So if the river drops, they get what the Americans call dewatered. And so that drives a hole in the recruitment for that year. And if you do it for 2 or 3 years, then you start to see a big hole appearing in the fish population later on for the anglers. So that's the sort of story that came out of it. Anyway, so that job was a bit of a gift. And I did also then that I should never have done. It was personally fascinating. The freshwater ecology type stuff started, biting hard.
Can I ask you? So you found it. You didn't find it a difficult thing to transition into the population ecology and the sort of broader environmental sampling and fish ecology,
No,
life
not really.
history,
Because
whatever?
well, on the other interesting thing, of course, is we've been sent to go and do survey trout all around the state. Part of it was a religious conversion exercise. It was to go to a place and invite all the anglers, most of the old fellows, to come along, and they'd all stand there saying, "You're not going to bloody find anything, mate. You're wasting your bloody time." And you go in there with an electroshock and you reef out bloody brown trout like this, and they go, "You must have put they all the stories, classic sort of thing, well known." So we had all these little mini religious conversions of these old guys who then started spreading the good news that actually there were fish around in these rivers that they liked. But at the same time, there were lots of other fish. So that's what interested me was then, okay, I'm catching a lot of other species here. What's the story with them? So I got really interested in a lot of the other native fish.
So what was the state of our knowledge of the native fish in Tasmania at that stage? Do we know much about the life history, the biology?
Well, there was one there were McDowell had obviously had a significant influence on understanding of native fish.
This is Kiwi Bob McDowell.
Yeah, in southeastern Australia particularly, and there was a fellow at Inland Fisheries called Wayne Fulton who's still working in still working in fisheries, and has been for a long time. And he started off doing a project on Great Lake, on invertebrates in Great Lake, but he became passionate about the native fish, the galaxies, paragalaxies, and did some really good work on life history and species, just discovering new species, all that sort of stuff. So Wayne was the sort of powerhouse of the galactid end of things, the Galaxidae and paragalaxies, in terms of native fish.
He described several paragalaxid species.
He was quite. He was seriously into it. So that was a patch that I couldn't really walk into when I was at Inland Fisheries because he was busy with it all. But I got increasingly interested in the whole issue of not only a fish community but also then how rivers and lakes actually functioned as ecosystems, and that's where I kept on.
Tell us a little bit about, because I know it's obviously been very influential in your life and my life to a lesser extent, and still is. Tell us a little bit about the Central Plateau of Tasmania and its lakes.
Where do
you start?
Long romantic involvement there, and you feel the same. We both got infected, not fairly similar periods, I think, with the love of that area. It's a mini sort of Canadian Shield situation where you've got up to nearly 3,000 lakes/wetlands, if you call them by the broad, international name. They are all wetlands, but some of them are more lakey than others. It's just a really fascinating environment. It's got a strong rainfall gradient from west to east. It's got a really interesting glacial history, multiple glacial history, with situations where you have endemic fish that are found, that were pushed out obviously to the margins of this glacial country during the intense glacials, and in some cases work their way back into this series of lakes that have been created by the glacial. So that a lot of these lakes a lot of the shallow lakes on the plateau are quite young. We're talking the last few glacial maximum, whereas a number of the marginal lakes are really old. So there's a really interesting interplay there between them. But it's a wonderful country, it's a wonderful country to be in. It's been badly damaged by historical fires and grazing and all that sort of stuff, and by the introduction of trout. But it's still wonderful to work in, and still wonderful to visit. And
do all the wetlands, lakes have fish in them?
No. A lot of them do have fish in them. And you wouldn't call it a fish community as such, because it's quite often just single species of locally endemic native fish, or native fish that have were presumed on the margins of the last glacial and moved back in, like one of the species you worked on, Galaxius cretaceous, but which over time are sort of starting to speciate, doing their weird gillraker thing and all that sort of stuff. Anyway, so it's really interesting like that. So you do have a lot of water bodies that have either no fish or or very low density, a strong gradient fish. Unfortunately, in some of those catchments, of course, you've got some brown trout and rainbow trout. So there's an interaction there that's interesting in its own right. I tried at one stage to get an experiment up to remove trout from a couple of lakes, but the politics of it sort of jumped on it.
And there's some endemic crustaceans, syncarids or something in those lakes too.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff in those things. In fact, a lot of the pointy bits around Tasmania have got syncarids in essentially their islands, basically, and there are a number of species that are unique to various pointy clumps around the place, and the Central Plateau is part of it. I'm working on the Plateau lakes again. I've kind of cycled back to them now because of climate change. So we can talk about that a bit if you want, because we're right in the middle of quite a intense project on that, and hoping to initiate some mitigatory demonstrations.
Is there concern about the effects of climate change on those lakes?
Yeah, well, there is. I suggested to the World Heritage Area sort of management people, and I work with a fellow called Mike Dreesen, who's an ecologist in the Tasmanian World Heritage Area Management. Really terrific, dedicated, very positive and active guy, and works on all sorts of issues. And we're sort of partners in crime on the smell of an oily rag to look at this issue. So we started off by putting temperature loggers in a dozen lakes in what's called the Western Lakes, just west of Great Lake. And it's expanded now to include a set of lakes around the Cradle Mountain area and more lakes in the Western Lakes, where we've also instrumented depth loggers and da-da-da. We're doing that for the last few years. And then ran a sort of a bucket hydrology and temperature modelling exercise to relate the data we were finding in those lakes to the local weather stations, Lywinnie being one of the weather stations that's got a nice long record. Built some models relating those to the weather data, and then started looking at what would happen if you introduce the long-term projections for rainfall decline in that area, and also evaporation increase and changes in wind runs, the length and duration of periods of wind. And I thought, oh yeah, this is a fun project. We should be doing this to just at least lick the stamp and say it's been done. And I had a moment on a Wednesday afternoon when I crunched the sort of core numbers and looked at the screen and went, oh, and realised, oh, it is a serious. This is not funny anymore. And then did this first part's all been published, but it done a preliminary risk evaluation of what's likely to happen with the potential for lakes to contract, to contract seasonally and maybe permanently, and also at the same time for them to become shallower. And we're now looking at the issue of the potential for enhanced wind resuspension of bed sediments. Wow. So that was a bit dismal, really, because we realised that nearly all of the Central Plateau lakes are vulnerable to substantial seasonal contraction and ultimately drying out over the next, starting within this 30-year period and going out to 50 to the 100-year mark. It'll be really quite intense in blocks. Obviously, the problem with the climate stuff is that the long-term projections are blocks of climate; they're not weather sequences. But if you actually then apply it to the weather sequences, historic weather sequences, and sort of the pattern, if you like, you can see that there are going to be a large number of periods of several years where these lakes really get a hammering, and ultimately, and some of them will be extinct as water bodies. There'll be wetlands, maybe, but
And is there anything that can be done? I mean, obviously there's the big picture stuff with climate, but is there anything that you've thought of, or other people are thinking about in terms of?
Yeah. Well, I'd learned. I think, and you'd done this because you and I dabbled in the Macquarie River in central Tasmania, and there's a system of broadwaters. They're essentially kind of lakes with a bit of river every now and then. We've got a few of those. Obviously, there are a lot of them in the eastern seaboard of Australia, and chain of lagoons type concepts. And there, when the early settlers arrived, they learnt from the indigenous nations in central and northern Tasmania to manipulate the outflow levels of these chain of ponds to hold water back during dry periods, so that they would hold water for longer, and also support the macrophytes and the mussels and so. And some of the anglers who fish down there also took that idea up to the highlands, because they recognised that during some periods, obviously in the past, of dry, some of their favourite little almost ponds, but lakes would suffer from quite significant drying, or declining levels. So they would fiddle around with the outflow sill. Some of them have got rock sill, some of them it's vegetation, some of it's just complex channels. They would play around with this and to hold water back during the from spring through into summer. So that's an idea that we're going to go through the process of seeing how politically palatable that might be within the context of the World Heritage Area, to as a potential mitigation action to protect some of the more vulnerable lakes.
Okay, can I take you back now, if I may, to a location that obviously majorly influenced you when you were very young, to Lake Pedder, because when I came back after, so I did my master's. Tell people I did my master's down in Tasmania, working on a Galaxius tritaceus, spotted Galaxius, in the Highlands, where Peter's just been talking about, and a couple of lakes up there, looking at the life history and following their life history through a couple of years. And I also compared them with two stream dwelling forms of the same species, because at least ancestrally the species moved in and out of freshwater into to at least estuaries, maybe the sea. It was part of their normal life cycle, but they couldn't do that once they became landlocked in a couple of these some of these western lakes. But when I did my master's there, I went across to WA and did my PhD, and then I came back, and Peter and I worked together on an environmental flows project in, as he said, the Macquarie River, the Meander, the South Esk, and the Mersey rivers. But when you worked at Inland Fisheries Commission in those days, basically you just chipped in and did everything. So you helped the inspectors out. You went up to Laiwini, you stripped fish and did all sorts of things. But I also helped out with the Pedoglacius, Glacius pedorensis relocation. It's a terribly funny story. Well, it's a tragic story for me. Hopefully Peter's forgotten about that. But maybe you can just tell us a little.
Damn, now I'm going to dig up what that was.
No, I won't. We probably shouldn't tell it.
Sorry, no, go on.
Probably shouldn't tell it because it involves the death of another fish. But anyway, yes, you're trying to remember now, aren't you? So, so Lake Pedder was dammed, I think, in 1972, much to everybody's, many people's horror, and became a much larger lake. And apart from the tragedy of drowning a beautiful quartz beach and the lake generally, Lake Pedder's was home to an endemic species, Glaxius pedorensis.
Yes, it was.
It's no longer in the lake, ever found in the lake?
Basically, no. No. It's essentially locally extinct from the system in which it was, created.
And I noticed before you moved your computer, when we're setting this up, that there was a photograph of Lake Oberon, I think, in the background on the wall, which has significance for.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about your involvement and?
Well, my involvement was it was a fairly large team of people who were involved in this. So Wayne Fulton was the driving force behind it initially, obviously, and then a few other players came on board: Andrew Sanger and
Premick
Hammer.
Yeah.
Who and they managed to get a reasonable chunk of a series of chunks of funding to support the project to first of all investigate what was going on, because the species had crashed, had declined massively, and was declining at enormous speed even during the monitoring, when the project was the initial parts of the project were running, and then they basically attempted artificial breeding, both in aquaria and in artificial ponds with little streams and all that sort of stuff, which was partially successful. It wasn't hugely successful, partially successful. but certainly didn't result in thousands of offspring. It wasn't one of those great success stories like that, unfortunately. But good. Well, a decision was made at one point that translocation was probably going to be the major string to the bow to try and save the species, because the numbers were just really plummeting. The artificial breeding wasn't doing anywhere near as well as expected, and so that's sort of where I came into as doing some kind of investigation along with this team of looking at different options for and criteria for translocation sites. We settled on a couple of places, and the top of the list was Lake Oberon, the Western Arthurs. And I was involved with Pramik in the translocation of some remaining adult fish that have been caught in the wild within inflowing streams into what is now the Huon Serpentine Impoundment. Thank you very much.
All right.
Salmon Lake changed its name from Lake Pedder to the Huon Serpentine Impoundment. And I followed those learnings. So adult fish were moved from there, not very many. There weren't very many left. And then, oh God, I've got to remember that my numbers now. I think it's something of the order of 20 to 30, I think, larvae, just sort of hatch. I think, I'm not even sure if they got to first feeding, but I can't remember that bit of it. But a very small number of fish were translocated on 2 or 3 occasions into Lake Oberon. And then it was silent, radio silence. So at one stage I did a back of the envelope, calculation of what are the chances. This is it's not a huge lake, but it's a very deep lake. It has all the right characteristics. It's a tannic lake. It's well protected from invasive, in potential for invasion by the climbing galaxias, which is one of the other major problems in the conservation of the species in its original habitat, because there's predatory interaction there. It had an inflowing stream with nice little characteristics in it that might be suitable for spawning, yada, yada. So did the back of the envelope calculation, and roughly knowing the ages of the fish that were adult fish that were put into the lake, and obviously of the larvae, or the young of the year. If you actually work out, estimate what their survival might be, just have a stab, a range, realize that if they were lucky in about something of the order of 6 or 7 years, they will end up with there would be 1 or 2 females left in the lake. That would be it, of mature age. And if they happen to meet each other and they liked each other and they did the deed, and the deed was successful, then you may end up with starting to see some recruits, very small numbers of recruits, in about 8-9 years. That was it. And to a certain extent, the project fell on a bit of a doldrum, because despite repeated sampling, there were no fish. Didn't find any fish, and then bingo. In that sort of window, suddenly there were fish that were obviously couldn't be anything else other than recruits of the original, or recruits that had come from the original release. And then it just bloomed from there. And so there's a very healthy population of the fish in Lake Oberon, well protected. And some of them were then translocated into another site near Strathgordon, a little less secure. And at the moment, that species is sort of on semi-stable grounds. Disappeared completely from its natural habitat, but it as a species hasn't disappeared. Some contentious argument about whether one should be doing these translocations, obviously, into other lakes that.
Yes, I remember some controversy around that time.
No fish. These lakes had no fish, but the biodiversity implications of translocating a single species, the problems of single species management, all that sort of stuff. Were definitely key to the whole thing.
So I remember you. I remember when I was working in inland fisheries, and you had a million and one projects going, and some great people working there at the time. Laurie Cook, who went on to work with you, and Jan Barton, I've caught up with a few years ago, I think at Deakin. I haven't seen her for quite a while now. A whole range of people, Henry Maxwell. John
Yep.
Diggle, who's now, is he still director or
Yep.
whatever?
Yep.
Yep.
He is Director of Inland Fisheries. There's Stuart Chilcott and
Stuart
obviously
Chilcott.
Wayne and Andrew Sanger, and then then we had Steve Malik, and a whole host of people who were, and then people would flip through.
Yes, yes, yes. But I think she shocked us all um, while I was still there. That you decided to, again, to maybe it was a roof experience where you had a complete change of heart. And you decided to quit as the senior biologist at Inland Fisheries, which was then subsequently, I think, taken over by Andrew Sanger, and you set up your own consultancy.
Yeah.
Why did you do that? That was, it was annoying for all of us, of course, because
I
you left.
felt,
But why?
well, I felt the constraints really for me of working in a government organisation were a bit too much, and I could see with some of my other friends who were in the Tasmanian Public Service at the time that the only way was up, and that meant you were going to be promoted into some, senior management level with upward-facing responsibilities to the minister and all this stuff. And that was just like, to me, that was kind of like a death. And I wanted to keep practicing applied, freshwater science. And I had the good fortune of having, I realised that I was attracting funds to do various projects, and I figured I could have a crack at doing that outside the government system. Very kindly, the zoology department at UTAS hosted me in terms of facilities and stuff, at least a room and a wet lab, and it went on from there really, and I got the gig very early on. Again, one of these out of the blue things, to coordinate the National River Health Program. So to at least support the science coordination of the National River Health Program that came out of the Monitoring River Health Initiative, which was born from the Darling algal bloom. Well, it was all, the sort of political impetus that was driven particularly out of Canberra, and
Nothing like a disaster to get people thinking about things.
Anyway, I got the gig. I just gave a kind of a pitch, I think, to what was Land and Water Australia in those days.
Maybe it was LERDIC, was it? Was it LERDIC? Land and Water Research and
Oh,
Development.
sorry, it was LERDIC. My apologies. It was Land and Water
Resources Research and Development Corporation.
I forget all these acronyms.
Yeah.
There were some good people there, and it was that was an amazing project to be involved in. And the response to the bloom was the actual management bloom had nothing to do with this program ultimately. But this program was really something that you're going to have to forgive me. I can't remember his name. Cullen.
Peter Cullen.
Peter Cullen had been, and that's where one of Peter Cullen's great strengths was to recognise the big themes and try and pull things together. And he realised that there was the idea of capping salt, the idea of putting a cap on water was there, but there was no information about the ecology of the system that was collected in a systematic manner in the Murray-Darling, but also nationally. So the MRHI ended up becoming this program to explore different ways of doing bioassessment in rivers around the country. The blue sky stage, the initial stage, that were fantastic because we tried all sorts of different things. Ultimately became focused on invertebrates, on sampling invertebrates for good or bad, and developing a kind of routine, if you like, bioassessment framework for that. But even looking back on it, the desire to have a routine standardised bioassessment system that applies to all the river systems of Australia is completely naive, and a lot of people, I think, fairly through that program and fairly early on started realising, well, actually, we're only looking at one time. We're starting to focus on one tiny window. There's a lot of stuff that's missing, and now much of the focus on river management, river restoration is across a whole range of obviously major compartments of the ecosystems.
That's not where Oz Rivers came from, did it? Was it that?
Yeah,
Or that? Yeah.
Oscar was born out of the initial MRHI funding,
Okay.
and that's where I cycled back and met
Richard Norris.
Norris. And Richard just sort of right into Ian and his crew at University of Canberra were kind of really keen on that very early on and drove it hard in Canberra. And I ended up being part of that impetus, which initially I thought was a good thing. And then after a while, I realised, first of all, only looking at vertebrates is too limited. And secondly, once you introduce a standardised system with a scoring system and all this sort of stuff, it's amazing how the people who weren't involved in the development of it, who come along and start using it, just switch off, have the potential to switch off their brains and just say, oh, it's gone from 0.2 to 0.24, whatever.
It's very seductive to have a number there that you can just point to.
The good side of it is it introduced bioassessment as a kind of a standardised thing into a lot of agencies around the country and slotted into things like licensing and various other things like that, and catchment reporting and things. The bad thing is it did that. They systematized something, so it becomes rather than a quest for understanding of the system.
There's a rule, I think it's called Goodhart's rule or something like that, or Goodhart's law, where as soon as you come up with a metric to measure something, it loses its usefulness, pretty much.
Yeah, no, that's pretty much. all the intellectual content of it was actually in the development. So there's a lot of argy-barging about various things. Way too much time spent arguing about mesh sizes of nets. But anyway.
I remember being at a meeting. I was involved with the CRC in those days, CRC for freshwater ecology, and we were trying to come up with some sort of similar standard way of doing fish sampling. And I remember Richard Norris walking into the room at one stage and listening to us talk, and we were arguing and just disagreeing generally with things, and he shook his head and said, I don't know why you fish people are so far behind us macroinvertebrate people, because we've been doing this for years. But he was sort of right to a degree, but I often think that the macroinvertebrate people talk about numbers and the fish people talk about species and life issues.
Well, my opinion of over after the River Health Program, then I end up segueing into chairing the Independent Sustainable Rivers Audit Group, ISRAG, which was charged with fostering the development of the SRA, Sustainable Rivers, the Murray-Darling Basin, which right from the get-go attempted then to branch out into a bunch of other themes, not just bugs. And in fact, my feeling is that at the scale of the basin, the bug theme is probably the least informative. It's not really, because of all the problems associated with the technology, if you like, and particularly thinking about reference condition and all that sort of stuff, which was, seemed to be a great advance in the beginning, but obviously as time goes on, you realise it's got really, quite strong limits. So the SRA was good because it started branching out into fish and into repairing vegetation and hydrology and all that sort of stuff. So that's good, a bit much more multi-thematic. But in the early days, it was very much the bugs were the flavour du jour. It came out of the UK, really. It came out of the RIFPAC's push in the UK, which was really not a bioassessment system. It was designed to be a system for identifying sites of special scientific interest, high biodiversity. So my feeling now is that the people in the space of river conditions, kind of assessment and measurement and interpretation linked to mitigation stuff, people have really got the kind of strength of other fish people, because there's a great community of fish biologists in Australia that have been working on this problem together in a collaborative way that puts quite a lot of the other disciplines to shame. I'm sure you have your opinions about the internal workings of that, but I'm looking from the outside and I see this community that sort of works problems out. And have been collaborating together for a long time. And the fish side of things forces people to think at multiple scales. So I know you are obsessed with very small fish at the scale of an E, the hydraulics and
I've just written the book about Murray cod. Thank you.
your real love is something tiny and seemingly insignificant, but of course it's not.
Yeah.
And right through to to obviously large scale, huge scale movements by fish throughout. This new information about it's fabulous. And then all the drivers that influence that from the hydraulic to the
Yeah.
land.
The stuff that Brendan, I've collaborated, with the Yucca project with Brendan Zampatti, and that stuff, looking at otolith microchemistry and movement is wonderful. It just gives us such
Great.
insights in what's going on.
No, that's brilliant. So that's and it's really fantastic to work with people who think of that sort of thing. I've always admired geomorphologists because there are geomorphologists and geomorphologists, fluvial geomorphologists come in different packages, but most of them think across scales and think about both the provenance of the landform, deep provenance, and the immediate provenance of beaches in channels and floodplains, and that's thinking like that is the thing that's really excited me about whole river and wetland ecology. This interaction of scale in time and space with the forces that drive movement of water, and then all the rest of it.
So is that what you had a long association with the Maritime Basin Authority and the
talking about
we're recording again.
Talking about the Maritime Basin.
Oh yeah. So I was just curious to know what aspects of that work, because you weren't actually hands-on sampling and sort of crunching numbers, I don't think, but you were managing and coordinating stuff there. What was the thing that drove you to keep doing that for so long?
Let's put it this way. I don't know. Where are we? I think the appeal was conceptual in one hand, being able to be involved with something that worked at that was setting up a system to diagnose the aspects of the condition of the river system at that scale using multiple ecosystem components. I quite like that. I found that a challenge, and I like bossing people around, so that sort of helps. My sort of fascist tendencies come out and stuff. I have had to learn to be much more collegial over the time frame, which has been a salutary lesson for me.
But was it also working with the people there that you enjoy?
Yeah, I really enjoyed working with the people I've worked with. Terry Hillman, John Harris, were sort of shining lights. Quite a few people in the MDBA who were terrific behind the scenes people. Because
that seems to be a pervasive theme through some of these interviews I've done too, and it certainly has been for me, is that the influence of the personalities and whether you want to, I've decided that several times not to work on particular things ever again because I'm essentially bored with it. I want to move on. But then there have been people I've loved working with, and I've continued to work on those things because I like working with the people. Really?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely spot on. I've really, you notice that when some of these programs come to an end, or because these things cycle, and there are periods of doldrums and stuff. I really miss spending time with someone like Terry, in a room just prattling on and talking both ideas and also just sorting out problems and that sort of stuff. It's great. It's fantastic. I love that. Yeah. And for me, it's been interesting because the segue, I've gone from a round bottom flask and measuring a trout to having to think about the whole of system. But in fact, now it's much more about the social and cultural aspect of how it gets managed. So obviously that bumps into politics and how well government interacts with scientists, which is a bit of a thing that I've got at the moment. I think I've seen in government as being a bit of a grumpy old man about these issues, because I'm a strong believer in government being informed about what they're managing and not simply throwing money at scientists to deal with something which is actually a social and cultural construct. So if you think about the issue of let's improve the health of the Murray-Darling Basin or protect it in some way, what does that mean? Unpack those words. And really think rigorously about what they mean and what the cultural context and the provenance is that you're using to say those things. And then when you want to then drive that into doing science, that you really need to have that thinking sorted out. And that to me is a dilemma. A lot of it is not thought out at that level enough. It's left to the scientists to do it. Now that's fine. I don't have a problem with, because some scientists obviously think across scales. They think at a whole of system level. But the context in which they're working has to be defined in a social and political environment. I don't mean they have to be constrained. I simply mean that there has to be a clear vision about what the entire team effort is aiming to do and produce at the end, and there often isn't. There's, oh, we're going to fund, monitoring of the Murray-Darling Basin. Who's doing it? Oh, they're doing it. Okay, well, let's set up a contractual arrangement and we'll get da-da-da, and they can monitor it for us and they'll tell us what's happening. Well, I think that's really, I don't think that's a mature way of dealing with the issues. I really think there has to be a much closer link between policy, program guidance, and scientific engagement. Those three things have got to.
We're not there. We're not there at the moment.
And the irony is, Peter Cullen, I think, was in that space.
Yeah.
But there aren't many Peter Cullens about, and I'm not pretending I'm one, but certainly I think it needs to be osmosed into government. Government has to be able to say, okay, this is the objective we're heading towards. This is, so therefore why we're doing it, and what we think we need to do that. We'll get some advice, obviously, and then engage the scientific community in that, both in the debate, but also in the doing.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, that takes visionaries. That takes visionaries really, and big thinkers to think that way. I mean, I confess quite.
Well, also I think there's another issue is that a lot of people, and it's much less now, but initially, particularly when we were doing, we thought science was pure. Science was this. We were all white Anglo-Saxon males to start with, for God's sake, and then eventually we realised, oh, there are women working in science, and thank God there are, and they should all be doing the science instead of us. But the whole issue of coming through and being trained as a scientist and thinking that what you're doing and pursuing is a purely objective thing, it's probably more so in the sort of in the astronomy world, for example, or cosmology, but in the ecology world, everything is so connected on the surface of the planet that our culture, our thinking, and our actions, obviously, are driving the whole system. And part of what's driving it is what's in our heads and where we've come from culturally and socially. That influences the way that we think scientifically. And so there's a vast history on this, and I'm only being pathetically amateur in expressing it.
No, that's all right. So let's maybe finish off, because we've been talking for a while now, about the sort of the art side of things and what you're interested in. So how did you're a visiting scientist, I think. Is that, I can't read my writing because it's so dark in here. I'm trying to get down to where you
a scientist in residence.
Scientist in residence, that's it, at the school, the University of Tasmania School of Art.
School of Art. It's now the School of Creative Arts and Media.
Right.
But I'm no longer that. It was for a certain period, and now I'm quasi retired. So,
but how did that come about? And you still doing it?
It came about because I suggested it to them, as in the school, because there was quite a strong culture of artists in residence in various labs. So you have an artist at SARO, you have an artist in the mines lab, and they'll be doing representational works often. And the artists were, quite free thinking. But the environment in which they're working as artists in residence sometimes can severely constrain what they're doing, particularly when scientists think that the artists are there to communicate their findings in various pretty ways. Or I'm being terrible. And I find that quite constraining. And because the conversations I'd had with particularly young artists were just so open and free-flowing and really stimulating. And yet when you started talking with scientists about, not all scientists, obviously, a lot of scientists have a very strong creative core to their being and are artists themselves. But the culture of a lot of the institutions where, scientific institutions where artists ended up being in residence, kind of regarded them as being service providers to their communications arm, you know what I mean? Which is an appalling
Hmm.
thing. So anyway, I had that conversation with some people in the art school, and they said, "Well, why don't you come and be a, you know?" I said, "We don't. Yes, you got artists and residents. You don't have any scientists and residents in your art school." And the same thing applies. You know, I'm not talking about the chemistry of pigments,
Hmm.
or how you bend plastic, or how the sun goes around the earth, but to actually have a really kind of free form, conversations. And that's all it was really. It was just a series of conversations, particularly with HDR students, and it was just brilliant. And as a spin-off of that, I got involved with MONA down here in Hobart, the Museum of New and Old Art, which is a strong emphasis on contemporary art, and some old stuff. And in a program to do with the Derwent River, an art sort of science interaction to do with that, which has had various facets. And then I sort of got enthused about doing land art. So I've got a land art piece at Ross in the Midlands, which was hopefully going to trigger some more action in that space up there.
And you wrote a book associated with that?
Yeah, I wrote a small book, which was actually more of a graphic book than I wrote the text, but the bulk of the interest is actually in the graphics. So I've got several women, including my wife Lynn, were involved in constructing it as a graphic object. So it's got some really great illustrations and drawings that go with the text, and the theme of the book was really about connections, about connectivity, looking at the landscape instead of a set of objects sitting around, but thinking about the processes and the connections that drive the both the location and evolution of the landscape and the structures in it. So that was fun.
And
I actually started that project wanting to write something about the ecology of the Midlands in relation to the impact of the clash of cultures between the Indigenous and the invader. White guy going and starting to think about the suffering of the Indigenous, just terrible. So I went in there and started reading all of these diaries and accounts of settlers and landowners and rarely Indigenous people in the archives, and it was so violent and bloody and appalling that I just felt this is not a space I should be in. I'm not a person who should be making any observations about this. It's not my place. So the book ended up being more about the ecological aspects of the landscape, and there's a very small bit in the middle which deals with the sort of Indigenous.
Yeah, it's difficult stuff, isn't it? It's difficult stuff to know how to navigate that side of things.
Impossible really for someone like ourselves, I think. And you get bitterly resented for it if you try and stand up. You're laughed at really if you try and be a white man talking about indigenous issues, particularly in the history of Tasmania, where it's been so repressive and so violent, and there's genuine hurt.
Yeah. And I've sort of, in writing this Murray Cod book recently, I've sort of trying to walk a line that is, I don't know, that is comfortable for me, but also not intrusive on others. And there's obviously a lot of stuff there, and a lot of the records are from European settlers and explorers and things. But as an ecologist, I never thought I'd be in that sort of situation where I'd be having to deal with issues from temporal issues and cultural issues, but it certainly makes one question what one's doing. You spend half your year generally, or maybe more in some cases, in France, and the rest of your time in Tasmania. Yeah.
Yep.
What's the future for Peter Davies?
Oh, I don't know. Well, probably more of the same. I think I'm still active in the sense that I'm involved with the MDBA, still the Murray-Darling Basin, sorry, and a bit of work in the EU. So that's science-wise. I'm still active, and we're just loving the life in this little village that we stumbled on 20 years ago. Got a lot of good friends there. We enjoy the lifestyle and the curious nature of the place itself, because it's one of these intertidal zones, a bit like the Balkans. It was Catalan, Spanish, French, and various kings and duchies and complicated history, and then the Napoleonic Wars, and then the Second World War. So it's got these layers of complex history, landscape, structures, people. Great.
Do you work while you're there, or is it purely sort of?
No, I work while I'm there. Well, I work while there. Yeah, no. It's in between bouts of rosé and sunshine. So the work that happens.
Sounds pretty nice. All right, well, we might leave it there. We've been talking for well and truly, I think, an hour and a half. So
Way too long.
we
If
don't
we've
want
got an audience at the end of this, we'll be amazed.
well, it's amazing what people will.
And we haven't even been
listen to and watch.
joking.
No, I know. We've been totally
I mean,
serious.
most of the time, if there is an audience listening, most of the time our conversations are ridiculous. Consists mostly of various stages of tears and laughter. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, hopefully
a strange umbilical connection, I think.
hopefully there'll be many more of those. I might just finish off with the little story that I wasn't going to tell about Lake Oberon, and we flew into Lake Oberon with the first batch of Pedoglaxius. I don't know if you remember in a helicopter. My only flight I've ever been in a helicopter, and I was part of that party. We flew in with these buckets of Galaxius preterensis, about to release them. And I think it must have been because I've been working on Galaxids for quite a while. I think that maybe there was some responsibility to me to make sure that they were what they were. Do you remember this?
I do. I remember. I don't remember the actual being there at the moment, but I remember. I remember
there was a climbing Galaxius, Galaxia brevitinus, amongst that lot, and unbeknownst to me, you'd looked in the bucket and realised there was one of those in there, and you took it out and euthanized it, to put it mildly, in front of me, saying to the group and saying to me specifically, "Oh, we only wanted to put in 9 or something, and we had 10." So,
oh yeah, that's right.
do you remember that? And I was standing there with my jaw down around my knees, couldn't
Thinking
believe
I just killed a Pedogalaxis.
just killed one of the last remaining Pedogalaxias in the world. Just to
right.
tell the audience, Galaxius brevitinus is very widespread and hugely abundant, and had actually invaded Lake Pedro, so it was a major problem, and we'd come within a hair's breadth of putting one of these individuals. I'm not sure
in with the lambs. Yeah.
that's right. And then you told me the truth, so I felt a lot better after that. Anyway, it's been a great pleasure to catch up and talk after.
Likewise. Likewise.
And there'll be at least one person watching this at some stage.
Okay. Well, to that person, I must say, hats off to you, Paul. I've always admired your enthusiasm and passion and energy, and your unrelenting good humour and.
You don't see me in the off days.
No, I don't actually. That's true. So just discount that. It was a completely deluded observation.
All right. Well, thank you, and see you around.
Okay. Take care.